Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. We've gotten some interesting stuff this time around, especially this interview with Devin Erickson.
Yeah.
Some really intriguing ideas about the future of education, AI, all that.
Yeah, his perspective is definitely relevant now with everything changing so fast. We were looking at that interview, plus his sci-fi novel, Theft of Fire. Some interesting parallels there.
For sure. And he pulls no punches. Like when he compares modern education to, get this, job training for slaves in ancient Rome.
It's pretty stark, right? But it makes you think, what is the purpose of education in the 21st century? Is it just job prep?
Or is there something more? Like Ericson talks about these 7 liberal arts of the modern world. This idea that we need certain skills to not just survive, but actually thrive as things keep changing.
He's got logic in there, statistics, rhetoric.
Research, too. Practical psychology, even investing. And then the big one, agency.
Yeah, those are all about being able to think for yourself, solve problems, communicate clearly, which matters more and more with all the information overload we have.
Absolutely. Take logic, for example. Being able to figure out what's true, what's BS, that's crucial these days.
Especially with all the misinformation flying around. And then statistics. You need that to just make sense of all the data we're bombarded with.
And rhetoric, the way Ericson defines it, is fascinating. It's not just about speaking well. It's about understanding how persuasion works, how it's used on us, and how we can use it ethically, too.
Right, because you got to see through the manipulation.
Yeah.
Being able to research things yourself, that ties into that, too. Not just for academics, but as a life skill.
Finding information, knowing if it's credible, actually understanding what it means. That's huge.
And then there's practical psychology, understanding why people do what they do.
It's almost like you need a psychology degree just to navigate daily life now, with all the ways people are trying to influence us,
It's true. And then investment. That's not just about money for Ericson. It's about investing in yourself, your skills, health, relationships, a long game.
Long game, yeah, I like that. And then there's that core concept, agency.
The tendency to initiate action to achieve your goals, he says, and argues it's more important than raw intelligence even.
So smarts aren't enough. It's about doing something with them.
He uses Elon Musk as an example. High intelligence for sure, but massive agency too. Taking risks, learning from when things go wrong, just relentless, even when things get really tough.
It's about actually making stuff happen, bringing your ideas to life.
Exactly. And the really encouraging part, Ericson believes agency can be learned no matter where you're starting from.
Which is huge, because it means we're not stuck with whatever we're born with, We can actually choose to become more proactive. But how do we do that?
Well, he has some practical advice about cultivating agency, starting with things like setting achievable goals.
Okay, that makes sense.
Embracing the process of getting better at something, even if you suck at first. And this one's interesting, weightlifting.
Weightlifting. How does that tie into agency?
He uses it as a metaphor. It's about pushing through resistance, learning discipline, consistency, the feeling of overcoming what you thought was your limit.
So building mental toughness alongside the physical kind.
Yeah. And he talks about pushing past your comfort zone in general, taking on things that scare you a little, learning to be okay with sucking before you master something.
That's a good point. Fear of failure holds a lot of people back. What if we embrace sucking as part of the process, right?
It'd be a lot more freeing. And it ties into overcoming those limiting beliefs we all have, the negative stuff that stops us from even trying.
Right, those stories we tell ourselves. Erickson's saying we got to challenge those stories, see if they're even true.
Yeah. A lot of this gets into mindset, psychology. It's interesting how he brings it all together.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the whole AI piece of this.
Yeah, and he does not hold back there.
Yeah.
He calls today's AI artificial stupidity to distinguish it from true human intelligence.
Which is where his novel Theft of Fire comes in, with those robot spiders, all that tech, all that power. But in the end, they're limited by their programming.
And the human protagonist, Marcus, outsmarts them because he can adapt, think outside the box.
Exactly. Shows how even with crazy advanced tech, human ingenuity still matters. Adaptability, creativity, critical thinking, those are huge, even in a world with more and more automation.
And Ericson addresses this head on. People are worried, right? Will robots take our jobs? Is it even worth pursuing goals if tech is going to change everything anyway?
Totally valid concerns. But look at Ericson himself. He went from software engineer to author. He changed his whole path.
So maybe it's about figuring out what truly drives you and adapting as you go.
That's what he did. And he encourages everyone to do the same. Figure out your why and be willing to change how you get there.
That sounds good in theory, but how do people actually do that when the future feels so uncertain?
Well, Erickson's point is that even if the specific job or tech becomes outdated, the skills you gain along the way, those aren't wasted.
So focus on building those core skills, that adaptable mindset, instead of trying to predict exactly what the job market's going to be like in 20 years.
Exactly. And this leads to what he says about storytelling and owning your work, which is fascinating.
Tell me more about that. This is getting interesting.
He thinks conservatives have made a mistake by stepping back from art and storytelling. The cultural battlefield, he calls it.
You mean if you're not shaping the story, someone else will?
That's his argument. He says stories have huge power. They shape values. They inspire innovation.
If a certain worldview dominates those stories, it affects everything else. even if it's subtle.
Right. And by not actively engaging, he argues, a certain set of assumptions becomes the default, whether you agree with it or not. And that contributes to feeling powerless because the dominant stories aren't offering solutions that resonate.
It makes you wonder what stories we're all consuming. Books, movies, the internet. It all shapes how we see the world, especially for younger generations.
And he sees a big opportunity here, a need for more diverse stories, more perspectives, different solutions, narratives that empower people instead of making them feel helpless.
And you can tie this to the AI conversation too, right? Human creativity and storytelling become even more crucial when tech is doing more and more.
Totally. That's what separates us, our ability to imagine, create, tell stories that move us. In a world with AI, that matters even more.
So it's not about rejecting tech, but recognizing what makes us uniquely human.
And that brings us back to agency. It's not just consuming stories, it's about creating them, shaping your own narrative, instead of just reacting to what's happening around you.
Taking a more proactive approach, not just in art, but in everything.
Recognizing you have more control than you think. And that starts with believing you have a story worth telling, a perspective that matters.
He's passionate about owning your work, self-publishing his novel, building his own platform.
Right. He sees tech as empowering. You can create, share, connect with people directly, no gatekeepers.
A very entrepreneurial mindset. And it's not just writing, it's anything you create, music, art, whatever.
The whole point is you have more control. And it builds a deeper connection with your audience because it's direct.
Like those creators on YouTube, Patreon, Substack, building whole businesses by connecting directly with their audience.
It's a big shift, but let's be real, even with all these new tools, building an audience takes work. There's no guarantee of instant success.
This is a lot to take in. Ericson's all about this agency, but people are probably feeling overwhelmed. Where do you even start with all this?
That's where those core skills come back in, those 7 liberal arts of the modern world. Like logic to filter the noise, stats to see patterns,
Rhetoric to communicate.
research to find good information, practical psychology to understand people. It's about having tools to navigate this crazy world.
And ultimately agency itself, right?
Yeah.
Choosing how you respond, even if you can't control everything that happens.
That's Ericson's point. Focus on what you can control, build those skills and that mindset, and you'll be better equipped no matter what the future throws at you.
He knows success doesn't come easy. Embrace the learning process, the mistakes. Keep building that resilience.
And build trust with your audience, whoever they are. Give value, be genuine, stay true to your vision.
It's about connection, building community, not just chasing fame or whatever, a more human approach. And in this tech-driven world, that's refreshing.
It is, but it brings up another interesting tension. This individual empowerment Ericson talks about. How does that work alongside those massive forces we were talking about earlier? All those big shifts that feel out of our control.
You're just getting into this idea of individual empowerment versus these larger forces. It's easy to feel like you're just along for the ride. You know?
Yeah, that sense of powerlessness is real. And Ericson argues that feeling is made worse by what he calls ceding the cultural battlefield.
Right, we were talking about that before. The idea that conservatives have kind of stepped back from engaging in art, storytelling. I want to unpack that more. What are the consequences of that, in his view?
Well, he's not talking about politics so much as who shapes the stories we live by. He says stories are incredibly powerful. They influence our values, what we aspire to, even what we believe is possible.
It's deeper than just entertainment, then. It's about how we frame the world, the problems we focus on, the solutions we imagine. And if one worldview dominates those stories, it shapes how we think about everything else.
Exactly. And he thinks by not engaging in this realm, conservatives have let a certain set of assumptions become the default, a worldview that maybe they don't even agree with.
And that contributes to this feeling of powerlessness because the dominant stories aren't speaking to them, aren't offering solutions they connect with.
Right. It's like you're not seeing yourself reflected in the culture, so you feel less agency, less like you can actually make a difference.
It's a provocative idea. Makes you think about the stories we're all consuming, right? Books, movies, even social media. It's all shaping how we see the world, especially for kids growing up immersed in it.
He sees it as a missed opportunity. Neglecting this leaves a vacuum, you know? He thinks there's a need for more diverse stories, different solutions, narratives that empower people instead of reinforcing helplessness.
And he connects this to the rise of AI too, which is fascinating. Like human creativity, storytelling, those become even more crucial in a world with all this advancing tech.
Absolutely. He says one of the most powerful things about being human is that ability to create, imagine, tell stories that move us. And when AI is getting better at mimicking human tasks, those creative abilities become even more valuable. It's what sets us apart.
So it's not about fearing tech. It's about recognizing what's uniquely human, our ingenuity, our creativity.
And that ties back into agency, not just consuming stories, but creating them. Shaping your own narrative.
Taking control.
Not just reacting to what's happening around you, but actively participating in shaping your life, shaping the world.
He seems to be pushing for a much more proactive approach to, well, everything.
Yeah.
Recognizing we have more agency than we realize.
And he thinks that starts with acknowledging you have a story to tell, a perspective that matters, and you have the power to share that.
He really walks the walk with this owning your work idea too.
Yeah.
self-publishing his novel, building his own platform.
Right. He believes tech empowers people to create and share their work directly. No gatekeepers. And that doesn't just apply to writing. It's music, art, starting a business, anything really.
It's a very entrepreneurial way of thinking. You're not waiting for permission. You're making your own opportunities.
And it's not just about control. It's about building a deeper connection with your audience because it's direct.
Like all those creators on YouTube, Patreon, Substack. They're building entire careers by connecting directly with their audience.
It's a huge shift, but gotta be realistic. Even with these new tools, building that audience takes work, persistence. It's not a magic easy button.
Right. And after all this, some people are probably feeling a bit overwhelmed. Ericson's all about this proactive, agency-driven approach. But where do you even begin? The world's so complex, it's hard to know where to put your energy.
That's where those core skills he talks about come back in. Those 7 liberal arts of the modern world. They're tools to navigate that complexity, even if there's no guaranteed outcome.
Like, logic helps make sense of information overload. Statistics helps see patterns. Rhetoric helps you communicate effectively.
Research helps you find good info and figure out what's true. Practical psychology helps you understand people, including yourself. Investing helps you think long-term.
And then at the core of it all is agency. Choosing how to respond, even if you can't control every external thing that happens.
That's what he's getting at. Focus on what you can control. Build those skills, build that mindset. You'll be better equipped no matter what the future throws at you.
He's also clear that success doesn't just happen. You got to embrace the process, the learning, the mistakes, the setbacks.
And building trust with your audience is crucial. Whatever you're creating, whoever that audience is.
Give value, be authentic, stay true to your vision. It's about genuine connection, building community, not just chasing fame for fame's sake.
It's a more human-centered approach, which is refreshing in a world that feels increasingly dominated by tech and algorithms.
Exactly. But that leads to another interesting point. This individual empowerment Ericson talks about. How does that fit with the influence of those massive forces we talked about earlier? The economic shifts, the technological advances, those cultural narratives even. It feels like there's a tension there.
There is, and that's a good place to pick up next time. How do we reconcile that individual agency with the reality that these larger forces do exist and they do shape the world around us?
So last time we were talking about this tension, right, between Ericson's focus on individual empowerment, create your own work, tell your own story, and the fact that there are these huge forces at play that feel way beyond any one person's control.
Right. Like, how do those two things even fit together?
Yeah, like he's saying take charge, but then there's the economy, tech changing everything, those cultural narratives we talked about. It's kind of daunting.
And Ericson doesn't dismiss those forces. In fact, he thinks feeling overwhelmed by them is partly because of the stories we're being told, or the stories we aren't telling ourselves.
So it's a perspective thing, too. Like, instead of feeling helpless against these big impersonal things, how do we find our agency within that context?
He keeps coming back to what can be controlled. Building those core skills, that's his big thing. Those 7 liberal arts of the modern world. They're tools, not guarantees, but tools to navigate all this complexity.
Okay, so logic to figure things out, stats to see patterns.
Rhetoric to communicate. Those matter no matter what specific jobs exist or what tech comes along.
Right, those are fundamentals.
And then agency itself. You can't predict the future, but you can cultivate the mindset, the skills to adapt to whatever comes your way. That's the point.
This is what everyone wants to know, right? How do you prepare for a future that's so unpredictable? Tech changes so fast, it's hard to know what to even focus on.
And Ericson's answer might surprise some people. He thinks getting fixated on one specific skill or job title is the wrong way to think about it.
It's more about being able to learn anything new as needed. Like the skill of learning itself is what becomes valuable.
That's the idea. He used the analogy of a programming language. That specific language might be obsolete in a few years.
Right. Things change so fast.
But the underlying skill, the ability to learn any programming language, the problem solving, the logic, that's what carries over.
That's really interesting. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying about education, right? Maybe it's less about memorizing specific facts and more about cultivating that adaptable, critical thinking part of your brain.
The part that can learn new things as the world changes. And this ties into his owning your work philosophy, too. It's not just about creating something. It's about the whole process of putting it out there in the world.
Building your own platform, finding your audience. He sees that as key to not just surviving, but thriving when those traditional gatekeepers are losing power.
Right. It's very entrepreneurial, maybe not for everyone, but it does give you a lot more control. You're not waiting for someone else to give you permission.
You're making your own opportunities.
Exactly. And building a community around what you're doing. It's about taking back that sense of agency, knowing you have something to offer, something to contribute, even amidst all the chaos.
And that your contribution matters, that you can make a difference.
He's not naive about it. It takes work, it takes resilience, but that's part of his message too. You got to build those skills, face those fears, stay true to your vision.
This has been really thought-provoking. I like how Ericson doesn't give easy answers, but he gives you a way to think about things, a framework to approach this crazy world.
He's all about action, too. This isn't just theory. It's about what you do with it. And I think that's what makes it so compelling. It's a call to participate, to shape the future we want, individually and together.
Well said. And as always, we encourage everyone listening to keep exploring these ideas, to have those tough conversations, and to take action. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a great discussion.
It has. Thanks for having me.